Chapter 7. After many visits to the United States over a period of more than 10 years, Gurdjieff had become known to a rather large group of people, particularly in New York City. Perhaps inevitably, as some knowledge of his work filtered down by a word of mouth to a larger public, he began to acquire a series of reputations. In addition to being known as a serious philosopher and mystic, he also became famous or infamous for being a charlatan, a quack, a faith healer, etc. As a result of these reputations, and also because of certain misconceptions about him and his work, he began to be sought out and visited by people from all walks of life for a variety of reasons that had little to do with his primary aim. As has been pointed out, he brought a good deal of this upon himself during certain periods, such as the times when people, for money, he performed cures for some people, or at least gave them some kind of treatments. While I have often thought that some of these encounters or meetings could have been, and might better have been, avoided, it is difficult and perhaps unfair to attempt to assess his reasons for allowing himself to become involved with so many different people. At the time, it seemed simple enough to speculate on the subject, and I remember having felt that he was, in a sense, trapped by his own unquestionably genuine interest in people and his equally genuine desire to help anyone who was in any sort of trouble. He was, on the other hand, an easy target, but given his complex nature, he unquestionably also amused himself with a good many of the games he played with people. Most of those who came to him were undoubtedly in some sort of trouble, and they were frequently sent to him by well-wishing members of any one of the American groups. In almost all cases, the trouble was of a psychosomatic nature, and the results of his advice were not always salutary, due largely to the lack of complete cooperation on the part of the suppliants. In one instance, a group of well-wishers petitioned him to come to the aid of a woman in her early 50s who, after having been at least supposedly a semi-alcoholic for several years, had sought the advice of a medical doctor for some ailment that did not pertain directly to her alcoholism, and part of her doctor's treatment had been to forbid her to drink alcohol in any form. Gurdjieff said that it would be necessary for him to see the woman before he could possibly consider doing anything for her, and after he had seen her and questioned her, he said that there was nothing basically wrong with her except that she was going through a period of chemical imbalance, which was perfectly normal for a woman of her age. He added, however, that her intake of alcohol over a period of years was in no sense alcoholism, and that, in fact, she had an endemic need for a certain amount of alcohol, and that to discontinue drinking entirely could be very serious, even fatal. He even prescribed the amount she was to take daily, and said that except for certain perfectly normal symptoms, they had to do with change of life, and would not last for a very long time. She was, as long as she continued to drink the amount prescribed, perfectly healthy. He added that it was important for several reasons that his advice be followed, and that it should not be disclosed to the doctor. He also said that he wanted to see her from time to time, and that, eventually, her need for alcohol would gradually diminish of itself, but that he would want to supervise the process. As to his reasons for not telling the doctor about his advice, he said that doctors in general did not like to have their patients consult other doctors behind their back, and to have their consult someone like himself, who was not a legally recognized physician, would make it inevitable that any doctor would immediately repudiate his advice and his prescriptions. The woman in question was, of course, delighted with his advice and showed immediate improvement, which, as Gurdjieff pointed out, was largely due to the fact that he had essentially agreed with her own diagnosis of herself. He added that this was not always the case, of course, but that this particular woman was generally very much in tune with her own system, and he urged her to follow her own instincts when she manifested any form of illness, and not to consult physicians except in emergencies or because of accidents which had nothing to do with her fundamental physical condition. The woman remained in good health for many months until a misguided, well-wishing friend of hers, anxious to interest the doctor in Gurdjieff, and to prove that Gurdjieff was, in most respects, a better doctor than the physician in question, told him that the woman's improvement was due entirely to following Gurdjieff's advice, which had been the exact opposite of his. The doctor, reacting as Gurdjieff had predicted, convinced the woman that she was slowly poisoning herself with alcohol and promptly had her hospitalized, having managed to convince her somehow that Gurdjieff was in reality a quack, with strict instructions against the consumption of any form of alcohol, and in a very short period of time the woman was dead. Gurdjieff was very distressed on learning of her death, and said that while it was true that the woman had been very much in tune with her physical self, she had not been a very intelligent or courageous person, and that she had not had the basic moral strength to resist trusting and continuing to consult a recognized physician-doctor. He also said that this was a very good example of what would inevitably happen when people consulted him and followed his advice, frequently radical, but did not at the same time manage to trust him completely. A similar case involved a woman who was slowly dying in a hospital, to the great distress of her friends. Gurdjieff was persuaded to visit her, and after seeing her, although not to the woman herself, that her after seeing her said, although not to the woman herself, that her illness was not physical, but that she had a strong desire to die, a death wish, as we would undoubtedly phrase it, and that she needed to have something to believe in and live for, as well as some immediate physical treatment. He managed, apparently, to convince her that there was reasons to continue her existence, and his treatment was to prescribe her daily olive oil enemas, which were to be taken without the knowledge of her doctors. She was able to do this by using a small baby-sized syringe and having small amounts of olive oil brought to her. He said that the reason for this prescription was that she had a condition which he described as a kind of long-term constipation due to her nervous and emotional state, and that her intestines were coated with hard, dried waste matter, which the olive oil would gradually break down, dissolve, and eliminate. The woman was enthusiastic mainly because of Gurdjieff's interest in her, and the treatment worked and her condition improved rapidly. When, because of the woman's boasting about Gurdjieff's medical abilities, the doctors learned of his advice, the treatment was immediately discontinued. This time, however, the woman lived, but when she was out of the hospital, she was vituperative against Gurdjieff because he had caused trouble for her with her doctors. Gurdjieff was amused by this and stated that she had achieved what he knew she needed. She now had a good reason to live, active hatred, with himself as the temporary target. While there was a good deal of discussion, pro and con, among the group members and others who knew about Gurdjieff concerning these two cases, neither of them caused him any trouble with either the doctors or the authorities. There was, however, one case that did cause him considerable trouble and which, eventually, made it difficult for him to stay in the United States or to re-enter once he had left. This case, like the others, involved a woman. As I remember it, the woman, quite young, met him in Chicago, and in addition to her interest in his ideas, became greatly attracted to him physically. He discussed her case at one time in my presence and said that she was an unfortunate victim of modern society and that she was not generally accepted by other people because she was physically unattractive, found difficulty in communicating with others, and had certain unpleasant manifestations which, although due primarily to her innate shyness, was displeasing to other people. He said that it was natural enough that she should fall in love with a man like himself, who had treated her with kindness and consideration. He also said that while it would be difficult, if he were able to work with her personally for a few months, he would be able to do a great deal for her, and that she would automatically grow out of her infatuation with him. One major difficulty in the suggested program was that the young woman's family considered her a semi-invalid and was very much opposed to her having any sort of association with Gurdjieff. In spite of this, the young woman managed to break away from her parents and follow Gurdjieff to New York, where she began to see him regularly and to follow him about like a lost lamb. For a time, she was an object of ridicule to many members of the New York group, and there was considerable loose speculation about the nature of her association with Gurdjieff. Many people, even among his so-called followers, seeming only too glad to seize on any exceptional association of Gurdjieff's as a proper topic for gossip and speculation. He once spoke of this to me and said that it was the rather sad but usually unavoidable reaction of people against anyone they profess to admire. While I know nothing about the nature of this woman's association with Gurdjieff, I do know that it was suddenly and rudely interrupted by the appearance of some members of the young woman's family who proceeded to accuse Gurdjieff of having immoral sexual relations with her and followed up the accusation by having her locked up in a mental institution. Up to this point, particularly since there was no proof to substantiate the accusations, there was not too serious, although a good many of us were worried about possible difficulties for Gurdjieff for practicing medicine without a license, and because of his status as a visiting alien in the United States. When the despondent young woman took her own life after a week of incarceration, however, the picture became very black because of renewed charges against Gurdjieff fanned, oddly enough, by the ardent feeling of some of his supposed followers. He was put in custody on, I believe, Ellis Island for a period of about 10 days. During that time, I heard every known charge against him, as well as a great storm of gossip and speculation, and also all the arguments of an opposing faction who had dedicated themselves to the cause of clearing his name. This latter group did finally prevail by using various kinds of pressure, but his name was never, as far as I know, completely cleared, and the incident remained a black mark against him. As a result, his stay in America was curtailed, and he left a divided group behind him in New York. Many years later, he referred to this episode and said that it had one extremely meritorious result, in that it had served as a shock which had separated the wheat from the chaff of his American adherents.